When people ask why I built my house the way I did, they expect an easy answer. Some want to hear about money, others about design, and a few expect me to say I was proving a point. But the truth is simpler and less glamorous. I built to survive. I spent 3 decades of my life in the cockpit of a Boeing, thousands of feet above ground, ferrying people who trusted me with their lives. Most days, it was routine. Charts, chatter, checklists. But sometimes the sky would remind us who was in charge. I've watched storms bloom like black roses on the horizon, turning from wisps of cloud to roaring monsters in the time it takes a flight attendant to pour a drink. I felt 100 tons of engineered steel shake like a paper kite in turbulence so violent it rattled fillings in my teeth. I've dropped through air pockets that stole breath from the cabin and left passengers praying under their blankets. Up there, you learn quickly. Optimism is a luxury. Nature doesn't care if you're hopeful or polite or living your best life in a freshly painted suburban palace. The sky is a predator, and if you're smart, you learn to respect predators. That's why when I retired, I didn't move to a Gulf community in Florida or quiet condo in Arizona like most of the men I flew with. I wanted a place where I could stand my ground, a place where my survival wasn't dependent on whether a board of neighbors thought my shutters matched their vision of coastal chic. That's how I found the land. 18 acres of overgrown swamp and forest, priced so low the realtor asked if I'd read the listing twice. Cypress and pine rose in ragged patches, their roots twisting out of muck. Herons stalked the shallows, and in the distance you could hear the throaty croak of bullfrogs under the drone of cicadas. It was beautiful in the way only wild things can be. Raw, inconvenient, alive. On the far side of the tree line sat Grand Water Shores, a development that looked like it had been dropped from a catalog. 2-story houses in shades of eggshell and beige, driveways lined with SUVs, and mailboxes standing at perfect angles like toy soldiers. Their lawns were manicured down to the millimeter, their shutters decorative instead of functional, their porches designed for appearances instead of shelter. To me, it looked fragile. To them, my land looked like a threat. I bought the lot in cash. No mortgage, no bank leverage, no one else's thumbprint on my deed. The first day I parked my truck out there, a woman in yoga pants, later I'd learned her name was Karen, marched across the boundary line with a clipboard in hand. She didn't smile. "You know this property is adjacent to an HOA, right?" she said, like I had accidentally taken a wrong turn. "I know where I am," I told her. She looked past me at the mess of weeds and cypress knees, nose wrinkled like she'd stepped in something foul. "We'll have expectations about fencing and sightlines. Property values are very sensitive here." Property values. Always those 2 words, spoken like scripture. I smiled without smiling. Good thing I didn't buy into your HOA then. That was the beginning. I started clearing by hand, felling trees and digging trenches with the patience of a man who has no schedule but his own. Instead of a stick-framed house with vinyl siding, I poured concrete. Instead of gabled roofs and exposed shingles, I laid down steel beams and hurricane-rated panels. The house rose slow, solid, ugly by suburban standards, but as dependable as a mountain. Neighbors from Grand Water Shores would slow their SUVs when they passed the edge of the property, staring like I was erecting a prison bunker. Karen visited twice a week, sometimes alone, sometimes dragging a gaggle of HOA loyalists who nodded at everything she said. They took photos. They sent me letters, sometimes signed, sometimes anonymous. This structure does not conform to community aesthetic. You are damaging collective property values. This development was intended to remain harmonious in design. They were right about one thing. My house didn't conform. I didn't want harmony with people who thought wind chimes were violations and grass longer than 2 inches was a crime. I wanted a fortress, not a fashion statement. At night, I'd sit on the unfinished porch and watch the lights of their houses across the tree line. Perfect rows of yellow windows glowing in the dark like a string of lanterns. But I also watched the way the wind tugged at their decorative shutters, how their roofs shuddered during summer squalls. I knew those houses were only as strong as the paper their blueprints had been printed on, and I knew storms were coming. Louisiana doesn't let you forget. The air itself is a warning. Thick, hot, unrestless. You can feel the Gulf breathing on your neck, waiting for the right conditions to spin disaster into being. Every pilot knows how fragile the balance is. A storm can grow from nothing, just a disturbance of air and heat. One day the horizon is clear, the next day it's a wall of water and wind with a name on the news ticker. So I built. Not to prove them wrong, but because I refused to be caught helpless. Garen didn't understand that. None of them did. To the HOA, my refusal to conform wasn't about survival. It was rebellion. And rebellion to them was intolerable.
If Chapter 1 of my life on that land was about choosing it, then Chapter 2 was about raising walls that could laugh at hurricanes. I didn't build fast. I built stubborn. Every part of that house was thought through, sketched, erased, recalculated, and tested again before I laid it down in stone and steel. Flying had taught me the cost of shortcuts, an overlooked rivet, a skipped inspection. Those things brought down planes. Houses may not leave the ground, but the principle's the same. The sky will find every weakness, and the sky doesn't forgive. I started with the foundation. Instead of shallow concrete footers like you see in subdivisions, I dug deep, deeper than the soil wanted me to. The swamp fought back, trying to flood every trench before I could pour. I rented pumps, rigged tarps, and worked knee-deep in mud until the forms were ready. I wanted a base that wasn't just sitting on Louisiana, it was part of it. Rebar thicker than my wrist, concrete mixed with fibers for flex strength, poured until the ground stopped trying to swallow it. The walls came next. Not 2x4s and sheetrock, not siding held on with nails you could flick out with a butter knife. No, I built in poured concrete panels, reinforced with steel mesh, 12 inches thick, layered with waterproofing membranes and insulation. My house wasn't going to sway politely with the wind. It was going to tell the wind to go to hell. Then the shutters. Steel, not aluminum. Hinged, lockable, able to seal the house down like a ship's hull. I sourced hurricane-rated glass for the few windows I allowed myself, each one double laminated, capable of taking a 2x4 shot out of a cannon without breaking. I bolted every frame to the structure itself, not the trim. My doors weren't decorative. They were reinforced slabs that latched into steel channels embedded in the walls. If a storm wanted to get in, it would have to tear the whole house apart first. While I worked, the HOA circled like buzzards. At first, it was polite. Karen stopping by with glossy pamphlets about community cohesion. She talked about neighborhood barbecues, shared amenities, property value protections. Her smile never reached her eyes. I knew a sales pitch when I heard one, and I wasn't buying. When polite didn't work, they tried subtle threats. A letter claiming my structure violated sightline harmony. Another warning that my fence height was inconsistent with the neighborhood aesthetic. They even went to the parish zoning board to argue my property should be annexed into Grand Water Shores. That stunt cost them thousands in lawyer fees and bought me a court order explicitly barring them from bothering me again. Round one, mine. Still they lingered. SUVs parked at the edge of the woods with people staring through tinted glass. Neighbors wandering too close to the property line with phones held suspiciously high. The HOA newsletter started including thinly veiled comments about non-compliant structures and uncooperative landowners. I framed those too, a gallery of their obsession. But I kept building. The shed came first, because you need a place to store the tools before you can finish the fortress. It wasn't much from the outside. Tin roof, simple door, but inside it was lined with racks of hardware, cans of fuel, bins and nails sorted by size. I put the bourbon shelf in there too, right under the framed injunction order. It felt fitting, like a toast to independence. Next came the water system, a raised tank, UV filtration, backup pumps. I'd flown over too many drowned cities to trust municipal lines. I wanted water even if the parish turned into soup. The generator was the crown jewel. Diesel, quiet, efficient. I dug a pad for it, built a shelter, and tuned the engine myself until it purred like a well-fed cat. That sound would become my lullaby in the years to come. By the time the house was livable, I was a year and a half into the project. Sweat, blisters, mosquito bites. Hell, I think I lost half my hearing to the chainsaw before I bought decent ear protection. But when I stood in the middle of my living room and heard nothing but silence, real silence, no neighbor's dog barking, no lawnmower buzzing, no HOA voice telling me my shutters weren't coastal approved, it was worth every drop of blood. Some nights I'd sit outside on the porch with a beer and watch the glow of Grand Water shores through the trees. Their houses were bright, but fragile. Their roofs gleamed, but I could already see shingles curling under the southern sun. My place, by contrast, blended into the earth, low and strong. Where theirs looked like stage sets, mine looked like it was dug in for the end of the world. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. One evening, as I was tightening bolts on the rain catchment system, Karen arrived again. This time she didn't bother with pamphlets. She stood at the fence line in her pressed khakis and polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo, arms crossed. "You are setting a dangerous precedent." I wiped sweat from my brow and didn't answer. People talk. They see your bunker. They start asking why we don't build stronger, why we don't prepare for storms the way you do. That undermines trust in the community model. It breeds fear. I laughed, maybe harder than I should have. Fear? Lady, what I'm breeding is survival. Fear's what you get when you build Barbie houses in hurricane country and pretend the wind is going to skip you out of courtesy. Her face tightened like a rope knot. We will not allow one man's paranoia to destabilize the neighborhood. Good thing your neighborhood stops at the tree line, I said, and turned my back on her. That was the moment I knew it wasn't just annoyance. They saw me as an enemy, not because I threatened them, but because I refused to need them. And to people like Karen, nothing is more dangerous than independence. But independence was the whole point. I built the raised beds next, filling them with soil trucked in from upstate, planting vegetables hardy enough to survive both drought and flood. I strung netting for shade, rigged barrels for irrigation, and built a compost heap out back. I didn't plan on going full hermit, but I wanted the option. If the world shut down for a week or a month, I'd be fine. All the while, the storms tested me. Summer squalls rolled in with sheets of rain. Thunder shook the windows. Gusts rattled branches and bent trees nearly half in half. Each time, my house stood steady. The shutters clanged but didn't bend. The roof shrugged off debris. Inside, I brewed coffee and read, listening to the generator hum when the grid flickered out. I knew it was only rehearsal. The real storm would come one day. They always do. When you spend 30 years in the air, you develop a sixth sense for weather. A pressure in your chest, a silence before the wind, a certain taste in the air. The Gulf was restless, hotter than usual, and the radar charts on my laptop showed too many systems spinning up. I watched them like I used to watch storms from the cockpit, tracking, measuring, calculating. Each one fizzled or turned, but sooner or later, one of them would come straight for us. And when it did, I'd be ready. The neighbors, the HOA, they'd still be arguing over paint swatches and mailbox heights.
The first year after I finished the house, the HOA tested my fences like wolves circling a campfire. They'd already failed to annex me legally, already burned money in court trying to claim jurisdiction. But stubborn people rarely accept clean defeats. They come back sideways, in whispers and small harassments. It started with mail. I'd find glossy HOA newsletters tucked into my gate like trash, the kind full of smiling families grilling burgers under the headline Community Spirit. They always had a line buried somewhere about non-conforming structures or challenges to neighborhood harmony. Sometimes they didn't even bother to be subtle. One man's bunker endangers everyone. Then came the visitors, realtors in polo shirts knocking at my door, offering to buy me out at market value plus incentive. They made it sound generous until you realized their market value was half what I'd paid, and the incentive wouldn't cover the cost of the generator. One even tried to tell me hurricanes were largely exaggerated by the media, as if 30 years of flying through storms hadn't told me otherwise. I turned them all away, politely at first. Eventually, with the help of a no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted signing block letters. But signs only work on people who respect boundaries. One Saturday in early June, I heard engines in the woods. Not chainsaws, not ATVs, engines that didn't belong. I stepped on the porch with binoculars and scanned the tree line. There they were, a dozen HOA volunteers in matching neon vests, lugging folding tables, boxes of flyers, and yard signs. They were setting up what they called Community Action Day. The tables went up like checkpoints, flyers stapled to tree trunks, full of slogans about unity and collective resilience. One sign actually read, "Don't let outsiders endanger our safety." The funny thing was, I was the only outsider for miles. I pulled on my old camo jacket, slung the chainsaw over my shoulder like a warning, and walked toward the tree line. The roar of the saw wasn't subtle. Heads turned. Karen herself froze mid-speech, her clipboard shaking just enough to give her away. "You're on private property," I said when I reached the first folding table. "This is community land," Karen snapped back, though her voice trembled. "No," I corrected, pointing to the stamped boundary markers in the dirt. "That's parish land. That's your HOA's playground. This is mine, and you're trespassing." A couple of her volunteers muttered. One man in cargo shorts started folding up his chair without being asked. The chainsaw growled as I thumbed the throttle, just enough to remind them what it could do to oak. Karen tried to recover. "We're here to raise awareness about non-compliance and collective risk." "Well, funny is, I'm here to cut firewood. Anyone want to test which of us gets finished first?" That ended Action Day real quick. They packed their flyers and tables faster than a rain shower clears a picnic. Round 2, mine. After that, the parish judge issued a second order. The Grand Water Shores HOA was prohibited from contacting, approaching, or attempting to annex my land in any way. I framed that ruling too, right beside the first one in the shed. 2 victories on paper, 2 reminders that the law still meant something, if you could afford the lawyer. But here's the thing about wolves. Even when the fire holds them back, they don't stop circling. Summer thickened. Heat pooled in the air like sweat that wouldn't dry. At night, the frogs croaked so loud it sounded like the earth itself was groaning. I watched radar charts more than TV, saw tropical systems spinning like tops far out in the Atlantic. Most died young, sheared apart by winds or swallowed by cooler water. But one, then another, kept forming closer to home. The Gulf was running hotter than I'd ever seen, and that heat was fuel. The storm they eventually named Imagigen started as a whisper, just a swirl of clouds off the Yucatan. To most people, it was nothing. But the first time I saw its trajectory, a knot tightened in my gut. It wasn't the storm itself, not it. It was the pattern, the steering currents, the pull of water temperature and wind shear. Everything about it reminded me of the flights where the cockpit radar went from green to yellow to red in the span of minutes. You learn to trust that gut after years in the sky. I spent the next week tightening the shutters, topping off diesel, and walking the perimeter with a critical eye. The raised beds were staked down, tools locked in the shed. The cats came in early each evening, restless as if they could sense the shift. Across the trees, Grand Water Shores carried on like nothing was coming. Sprinklers ticked on manicured lawns, neighbors held pool parties, Karen hosted a hurricane preparedness social with wine coolers and yard games. I knew what they were really doing, pretending optimism was stronger than weather. That was their mistake. Storms don't care about optimism. They only care about physics. When Imagigen got its name, the news anchor said it with the same false cheer they use for morning traffic. Currently a Category 1, expected to strengthen modestly. Modestly. I shook my head. The Gulf doesn't do modest. By the third day, Imagigen was a Category 3. By the fourth, a 4. The spaghetti models looked like someone had spilled a bowl of noodles over Louisiana, and every strand curved closer to us. I remember standing on my porch at dusk, the sky bruised purple, the air too still. The tree line whispered, not with wind, but with the sound of people hammering plywood over fragile windows. SUVs loaded with coolers and duffels pulled out of Grand Water shores in convoys. Not everyone left. Some stayed, convinced this one would pass like the last. That was the night I knew the real test had come. I closed the shutters, checked the generator, brought the cats inside. I made a pot of coffee strong enough to float a spoon, sat at my table, and waited for the sky to decide my fate.
Storms don't arrive politely. They don't knock, they don't clear their throats. They roar in like they've been waiting years to settle a score. Imagigen announced itself at dusk with a moan in the trees. Not a breeze, not a gust, a sound, low and steady, as though the air itself was straining against invisible ropes. My shutters were locked, generator humming, every tool put away. The cats curled into one corner of the couch like they wanted to melt into the cushions. By midnight, the storm had grown teeth. Rain slapped the steel shutters hard enough to sound like gunfire. Branches cracked outside, followed by the thud of trunks hitting the ground. Every strike reverberated through the earth and into my bones. I checked the monitors, watched the anemometer spin past readings I didn't like, then past readings I didn't think possible. From the cockpit, storms always looked like something distant, massive, yes, but removed, a system you threaded through or around. Down here, there's no threading. You're at its mercy, inside its lungs. The pressure dropped until my ears popped. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive, like it was trying to push me into the floor. Outside, the wind screamed, not whistled, screamed, a pitch so sharp it cut through concrete, through bone, through thought. At one point, something slammed into the roof. A tree, maybe. A signpost. Hard to say. The impact rattled dishes in the cupboards. I stood under the crossbeam, one hand on the concrete wall, and felt the vibration echo through the house. But the beam held. The walls held. The bunker I'd spent years sweating over was proving itself, piece by stubborn piece. I brewed another pot of coffee. The storm howled. I read a paperback, pausing when the noise outside swelled too loud to ignore. At one point, I even dozed off, lulled by the rhythm of rain hammering steel. That's how confident I'd become in what I'd built. Or maybe it was just exhaustion. Somewhere in the night, a strange silence fell. Not calm. Calm has warmth to it. This was void, the eye of Imagigen. I cracked open the inner door, unlatched a single shutter, and looked out. It was like stepping into another world. The air was thick, damp, and eerily still. Branches littered the yard, some as thick as my torso. The trees leaned like drunks, stripped of leaves, raw wood glistening in the moonlight. My fence was bent but not broken, and beyond the line of my property, Grand Water shores looked like a child had kicked over a dollhouse. Roofs peeled away like paper lids, shingles scattered across flooded streets, porch swings tangled in downed power lines. I spotted a kayak stranded in the middle of the road, marooned like a lost toy. The silence wasn't peace, it was anticipation. The storm wasn't finished, it was inhaling, ready to strike again.
I sealed the shutter and went back inside. The second half hit harder. The backside winds came screaming from the opposite direction, slamming into my house with renewed fury. I sat with my back to the wall and let the storm rage, the way you let a drunk rant until he burns himself out. Hours bled together. The generator purred, steady as a heartbeat. My house never flinched. I had built it for this exact moment, and it was paying me back. By dawn, the worst had passed. The rain slowed from bullets to steady sheets. The wind softened to ragged gusts. Imagigen had spent its rage and moved inland to chew on other towns. The silence afterward was almost worse than the noise. I didn't open the door until the second morning. Call it superstition, call it discipline. I wasn't going to stumble out into standing water or downed lines just because the sun was shining. So I waited, checked the gauges, brewed more coffee, and let the world outside settle. When I finally unlatched the storm door and stepped out, the quiet hit me harder than the wind ever had. The landscape was unrecognizable. Trees stripped bare, branches scattered like bones, fences flattened, cars shoved sideways into ditches. The smell, God, the smell was rot and seawater, insulation and gasoline. A smell of endings. A kayak still sat in my driveway. No water in sight, just a boat delivered by chaos. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see Karen marching out with her clipboard ready to blame me personally for the storm. But the HOA world was silent. The line between their land and mine was erased, shredded down to splinters. Against my better judgment, I walked toward Grandwater Shores. The closer I got, the worse it was. Houses gutted, walls gone, slabs bare except for twisted pipes. A kiddie pool dangled from a power line like a grotesque ornament. People wandered, dazed, carrying bags or nothing at all. I found one woman trapped under the remains of her porch steps. She didn't speak, just clutched my arm like I was the last solid thing in the world. I pulled her free, half-carried her to a church where survivors were gathering. I carried an old man, barefoot and bleeding, half a mile through muck to a shelter. I gave up one of my backup generators to a family with toddlers and a diabetic wife. Not because I owed the HOA anything, but because decency doesn't stop at property lines. But I didn't see Karen. Not yet. On the third day, the mail came. That's the absurdity of America. You can lose roofs, power, even the illusion of safety, but somehow the mail keeps coming. A FEMA truck rumbled past, followed by the county jeep with a postal worker tossing damp envelopes into tilted mailboxes. Mine wasn't in the box. It was laminated and taped to my gate like a proclamation. Official letterhead, a seal, a number that made me laugh out loud in disbelief. 10,184,233. 10 million. The letter claimed I was liable for communal restoration of Grandwater Shores, roads, landscaping, homes, because my house had survived untouched. It accused me of refusing to participate in collective stormproofing measures, and my personal favorite, suggested my home's survival raised valid concerns of intentional exposure deflection. They were accusing me of deflecting a hurricane. That was my crime, not losing. I sat in the dirt with the letter in my hands and laughed until my ribs hurt. Then I folded it, carried it inside, scanned it, and sent it to Raymond, my attorney. He called me back laughing harder than I was. He said, "That's not a lawsuit, that's an acid trip on stationery." But his voice turned serious. "Miles, if they're serious, this is going to get ugly." He was right. Imagigen hadn't just torn down houses, it had ripped away illusions. It left people looking for someone to blame, and somehow I was the perfect target.
Imagining had come and gone, but storms don't leave clean exits. They drag debris, silence, and something heavier behind them. In the weeks after, the parish looked like a battlefield. Power lines sagged like vines. The grocery store parking lot became a soup kitchen. National Guard Humvees prowled the streets, handing out bottled water with the same blank faces soldiers wear overseas. But what haunted me most was the noise, or rather, the lack of it. The swamp sang as it always did, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, birds screaming at dawn. Life adjusted. But Grandwater Shores? Silent. No leaf blowers, no barking dogs, no kids on bikes. Just the occasional cough, hammer, or muted wail. I spent my days repairing fence lines, hauling limbs, burning what couldn't be salvaged. Nights were quiet, except for the low thrum of my generator, a sound of survival. But to the neighbors who lost everything, it was the sound of envy. I tried to help, brought diesel to the church shelter, loaned tools, even gave up a stack of plywood to a man patching what was left of his roof. He didn't say thank you. He just took it with a look I recognized, shame sharpened into resentment, because my house stood while theirs hadn't. By the second week, whispers spread. At first, it was just muttered as supply lines. How'd his place make it? What's he hiding in there? Then came the accusations. One man cornered me at the gas station, jabbing a finger into my chest. Storm skipped your land like it knew better. You tell me that's natural. I laughed it off, but his eyes weren't joking. Then came the online forums. A neighbor showed me on his phone. Facebook groups, community threads, pictures of my house standing tall, surrounded by rubble. Captions like, engineered to deflect storms, built with government tech, maybe even caused the surge to shift. Conspiracy theories spread faster than any hurricane. Within days, people were calling me a saboteur, a profiteer, a man who had cheated death at the expense of others. Some said my foundation redirected floodwater into the community. Others said I had seeded the clouds with pilot tricks for my flying days. It was absurd. It was insane. But absurdity doesn't stop a mob. It fuels it. And then came the letter. That $10 million claim wasn't a bluff. The Grandwater Shores HOA, what remained of it, filed an official lawsuit. Their argument was that by refusing to comply with community storm measures, I had endangered and ultimately destroyed the neighborhood. Raymond nearly choked when he read it. They're suing you because your house survived. That's their entire case. Miles, I've seen ridiculous suits, but this one belongs in a circus. Yeah, but circuses still sell tickets. And sell tickets it did. The story hit the news. Local channels first, then regional, then national. A reporter actually stood at the end of my driveway one morning, hair perfect despite the mud, talking into a camera about the man whose fortress survived Imagigen while a neighborhood crumbled around him. Karen was back too. Of course she was. Somehow she survived, though rumor had it she fled inland the day before the storm. Now she stood on TV beside the wreckage of Grandwater Shores, eyeliner smudged for maximum sympathy, calling me a reckless individualist whose anti-community choices had condemned her neighborhood. She made it sound biblical. One man's arrogance, the whole community's punishment. I turned off the TV, but turning it off didn't stop it. Neighbors I'd once helped cross the street to avoid me. At the parish meeting hall, when supplies were distributed, people muttered when I answered. That's him, they whispered like I carried the storm in my packet. One night, someone spray painted my gate, Hurricane Witch. I scrubbed it off in silence. But the worst wasn't the gossip or even the lawsuit. It was the creeping realization that survival had made me the villain, that I was safer in the storm than in the calm that followed. Raymond prepared me for court. He said they don't have evidence, but they have emotion, and sometimes that's enough. He gathered my receipts, blueprints, building permits, every scrap of paper proving I built by code and by law. Still, doubt gnawed at me. Not because I believed their nonsense, but because I'd seen mobs before, in smaller forms. On flights where one passenger panicked and the fear spread row by row. On juries where outrage overweighed reason. The parish scheduled the first hearing for late fall. By then, Imagigen scars were fading. Roads cleared, stores reopened. Grandwater Shores tried to look normal again, though half its houses still wore blue tarps like bandages. The courthouse smelled of mildew and coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead.
Karen sat across from me in a tailored suit, her expression smug like she'd already won. Her lawyer, a sharp-chinned man who looked allergic to manual labor, spread photos across the table. My house, untouched. Their houses, rubble. The contrast was undeniable. It looked like guilt. But facts are stubborn. Raymond started slow, walking the court through my permits, construction methods, compliance with every law. He explained that the parish had inspected and approved my build twice. He laid out receipts showing my out-of-pocket expenses, my refusal to accept HOA buyouts, my independence. Then he dropped the hammer. An affidavit from Tom, the HOA treasurer. Tom hadn't been seen much since the storm. Rumor had it he was hiding out of shame. Turns out he was hiding something else. He admitted, in writing, that the HOA had mismanaged funds for years, skimming money meant for drainage systems, diverting cash into pet projects and community socials. Worse, they'd pressured contractors into cutting corners on new builds, choosing vinyl siding over reinforced concrete, asphalt shingles over storm-proof metal. When the storm hit, those shortcuts weren't just weaknesses, they were invitations. Tom's statement broke the room like a dropped glass. Karen's face froze. Her lawyer stammered, tried to pivot, but it was useless. The judge leaned back, unimpressed, and said plainly, "From what I see, this man's only crime was building better." Case dismissed. It should have felt like victory, but victories don't always taste sweet. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters shoved microphones in my face, asking if I felt vindicated. A crowd had gathered, some cheering, more booing. I walked through them, like through turbulence, steady on the outside, rattled inside. Because I knew storms weren't over. Imagining was only the first, and mobs don't need hurricanes to form.
The night after the summons, I couldn't sleep. The house hummed with its usual quiet strength. The low thrum of the generator, the cats padding along the hallway, the creak of concrete settling into the earth. But my mind wouldn't still. Every shadow out the window looked like headlights. Every rustle of wind through the trees sounded like whispers, plodding just beyond the fence line. That was the thing about pressure. A storm outside you can handle. It's noise, fury, and physics. You build for it. You brace. You outlast. But storms inside, they eat you slowly. I sat in the shed with bourbon and the framed injunctions hanging above me. 2 victories, once so satisfying. Now they felt like paper shields against a wildfire. I had just about convinced myself I could ignore the noise, that the HOA's lawsuit was bluff and bluster, when I noticed the envelope. It hadn't been there when I first came in, just sitting on the workbench, plain manila, sealed with blue painter's tape. No postage, no markings, no fingerprints I could see. Whoever left it had walked right past the cameras and motion lights without a trace. I turned it over, once, twice, then peeled the tape. Inside was a USB drive and a single piece of paper with one line typed in block letters. "If you want the truth, look inside." I can't do this anymore. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether plugging it in was brilliance or suicide. Viruses, trackers, ransomware, it could have been anything. I scanned it 3 times with security software before finally clicking open. What came up wasn't a virus. It was worse. Hundreds of files, emails, spreadsheets, PDFs of scanned contracts. HOA letterhead, meeting notes marked confidential. Financial ledgers with amounts circled in red. One folder was labeled Phase 3 Consolidation. I clicked it. Up popped a memo written in the kind of bloodless corporate language only evil can manage. It outlined strategic objectives for Grandwater Shores, consolidation of surrounding properties through zoning pressure, targeted annexation, and negative incentive deployment. My land was circled on a map. The memo even had a bullet point under my name, High Priority Resistance Zone. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was plan. I wasn't just an enemy. They had written it into their playbook. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. Transfers from the HOA's so-called emergency reserve fund to personal accounts of board members. Crypto transactions routed through offshore wallets. Fake insurance certificates distributed to residents as if coverage actually existed. People had been paying premiums for years believing they were protected. Meanwhile, the board skimmed and pocketed the money. And when the storm came, when the roofs tore off and the waters rose, those families had nothing but empty promises. No wonder they needed me as a scapegoat. If the truth came out, Karen and her crew weren't just petty tyrants with clipboards. They were criminals. I was still staring at the files when headlights flared at the edge of the woods. My hand went to the shotgun propped against the workbench. But it wasn't the HOA. A knock at the door. Slow, deliberate. I cracked it open. A man stood there in a windbreaker 2 sizes too big, shoulders slumped like the fabric was carrying his shame. His hair was thin, his eyes bloodshot but steady. He raised his hands as if to show he wasn't a threat. "Name's Tom Brady." Then with a dry smile, "Not that one. I was treasurer for the HOA board, until last week." I didn't answer, just kept the barrel angled low but ready. He sighed. "I left something for you. The USB. But I've got more." He pulled another flash drive from his pocket and set it on the porch railing like an offering. Emails, recordings, proof of where the money went, proof Karen knew. Why give it to me? He glanced over his shoulder as though the trees themselves were listening. "Because I'm done. I thought it was just shady bookkeeping at first. Then the storm hit, and I watched people lose everything, while Karen smiled through a fundraiser talking about resilience branding." His voice cracked. She knew they had no insurance. She knew. For a long moment we just stood there, the whistleblower and the holdout. 2 men caught in the undertow of something bigger than both of us. Finally, I lowered the shotgun. "You realize giving me this makes you a target too." "I already am." He rubbed his temples. "I've seen the emails. They were going to pin it all on me anyway. Treasurer signs the books, right? Might as well burn the whole thing down." He pressed the second drive into my hand. His palm was clammy, his grip desperate. "Just don't waste it." Then he turned and walked back into the night without waiting for thanks. I stood there a while, the flash drive heavy in my hand. Part of me wanted to throw it into the fire pit, let it all vanish in smoke. But another part, the same part that made me build the house bunker tight, knew better. You don't run from storms. You face them head on. The next morning, Raymond and I sat in his cluttered office surrounded by paper towers of evidence. He skimmed file after file, his permanent smirk growing sharper by the minute. Fraud, embezzlement, wire transfer violations. Hell, we might even have RICO if we can prove conspiracy. He jabbed a finger at one email chain. "And look at this. Explicit discussions about annexing your property despite a standing injunction. They didn't just break the law, they bragged about it." I sipped burnt office coffee, staring at the USB drive like it was a grenade. "So what now?" Raymond leaned back, folding his hands behind his head like a man already tasting victory. "Now, we stop playing defense. We countersue. Defamation, harassment, violation of injunction. Then we hand this little treasure chest to the parish DA and the feds. Let them dig into the fraud. By the time we're done, Karen won't be worrying about your bunker house. She'll be worrying about commissary menus." His grin was wolfish. Mine wasn't far behind. For months they had painted me as the anomaly, the storm deflector, the selfish holdout. But with Tom's evidence, the truth was finally clear. I wasn't the danger. I was the proof they couldn't control. and now I had the storm on my side.